mention a couple of things. Outlines are on the back. Excuse me. Outlines are on the back, and on Sunday we'll need to clear the tables for affirming the faith. So if there's any from this week that you'd like to try to locate, you're welcome to do that, but we'll be moving them to tidy that up. One of the things I want to mention, and we're going to be in chapter 31 here in just a second, but there are a lot of wonderful ways to study the book of Proverbs, especially in terms of topics and themes. And we did a Thursday, we call it Golden 60s class, and I think I did like 20 different topics from Proverbs that we haven't had time to look at. But I wanted just to mention this. In the narrated Bible, F. LaGard Smith, being an attorney and kind of thinking in terms of, blocks of things and other stuff, his section on the Proverbs of Solomon opens with the first part, the comments about wisdom, and then he does thematically the Proverbs by just different themes as you go through. And I just find things like that helpful. Like I just opened a page. Here are the verses on the fear of the Lord. The next topic, trust in God or self, divine providence, dealing with fools. And so there's just a variety of topics that are there. And sometimes I think it's helpful just to kind of select different themes and different topics to look at as you go through this. I want to start on the back page, if you have this. If I get a chance to talk to our young people leaving high school, going into college, I love to talk with them about what is the difference in kind of studying to just kind of pass in high school and studying for a career. And to me, there's like a whole different paradigm involved in that. And my wife is a remedial special ed teacher, and I've always tried to keep her on the cutting edge of her profession. And I've told her friends it's not often that wives are able to financially benefit from skills they've earned in their marriage. And so she didn't have to go to seminars. She could just come home and I could keep her on the cutting edge. But since I'm a little slow, then I've spent 23 years in some kind of school after I've left Oklahoma Christian, studying just a variety of things and obviously working in the church and doing things on the side. But the very first thing that I talk to young people about is, and we talk to our kids, what happens if you make straight A's, you make the honor roll, and you do all the other things like that, and you lose your soul in the process? And anytime someone is working on, particularly an academic study of all things, and you never know when something like this is going to come up, fortune cookie wisdom. A goal is a dream with a plan and a deadline. What are you doing? Why? How are some things you're going to go about it? And then I have like 3 pages of things I like to walk through in terms of paradigms in order to kind of prepare to do that. But regardless of what your goal and your dream is, talking to a potential college graduate student, the very first thing you need to do is have in mind to save your own soul. And the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And whatever you're going to study and whatever you're going to do, if you don't keep that in mind, again, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world, loses his own soul? And then as you go through, and we've looked at some of these Proverbs 3 and 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him. Proverbs 12 and 20, deceit is in the heart of those who devise evil, but those who plan good have joy. 13:20, he who walks with wise men becomes wise. 15:33, the fear of the Lord is instruction in wisdom. And if we had more time, we would stop some on chapter 16 because we have these various collections through the book of Proverbs that, again, we'll just highlight as we go through. But chapter 16 is kind of one of those very center points that are in the book of Proverbs, and it always revolves around these types of things. 16:9, a man's mind plans his ways, but the Lord directs his steps. And so as you look through these, and again, these were just samples of things that we can talk about, but there's just a real sense that any sense of wisdom, knowledge, discretion, understanding, insight, all of those things that are introduced in the first 6 verses, then come together in verse 7, which is the motto, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And there's a group of others that just for time we won't go through. If we were in a smaller group, weren't so spread out, I would just start with this. Ladies, how do you feel when you read Proverbs 31? Temple, how do you feel when you read Proverbs 31? Do you feel, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, just how do you feel? Maybe a little overwhelmed. Sheila calls her the mythological lady who could do everything. And there's just kind of a list of all of these types of things. And one of my friends said, I get tired just reading Proverbs 31 of all the things that are there. What I want to do tonight is to see how the chapter unfolds, particularly in terms of the development of thought and the progression of the book. So we did a couple of these things earlier, but I wanted to just touch on them in terms of the outline. Remember, chapters 1 through 9 is this especially instruction from a father to his son. And 1 through 9 is going to set both the tone and the paradigm for all the rest of the book, because the instruction that the father gives to his son then are going to be given, especially in contrast and in parallel statements through the rest of the book. There's a group from 10 through 22:16, Proverbs of Solomon, and then 22:17 through 24:22, words of wise men. Then there are further words of wise men through the rest of chapter 24. And then there's another collection of the Proverbs of Solomon, 25 through 29. And then as we come toward the end, and this is where we're going to end up tonight, the words of Agur, chapter 30, King Lemuel is going to be the first part of 31. And then this is what we're going to kind of talk through and look at. And we just touched on this last week. Chapter 31, 10 through the end, is an alphabet acrostic. And so if we just do it in English, then the first verse is going to start with A, and then the next one's going to be with B, except they'll be in Hebrew. And so as you go through the latter part of Proverbs 31, it's an alphabet acrostic. And when you look at that, and at least this is just how, none of us are inspired with the Spirit or writing things like that. What words would you start with X, Y, and Z? I mean, did you see what I'm saying? If you do an alphabet, there's some words, A, and some others would be really, a lot of different words would come to mind. But if you're going to do an acrostic in English, then I would have to be making some notes, and what about this, and where does this fit? And when you get to X, Y, and Z, that would be a whole different challenge than doing some of the earlier ones. And this isn't the only place this is done, but a couple of things need to be said. One person, speaking of English, he said, this is the A to Z about information you need to know about knowledge. So if we were reading Hebrew and it would be written in the Hebrew alphabet, then from the beginning to the end, then each of these verses are going to begin with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. But notice again this fear of the Lord. It's the motto in chapter 1, verse 7, and through that instruction to my son, over and over and again, my son. When you come to the end of chapter 9, then the fear of the Lord is used. But if you look at the whole book, chapter 1, verse 7, down through 31:30, Charm is deceitful, beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Then the fear of the Lord is kind of the opening and the closing of the book. If you look under 3:1, Psalm 37, 111, 112, and then when you come to 119, this is also an alphabet acrostic, but they're in sets of 8 verses. So let's do it in English. Psalms 119, verse 1 in English, if we did it that way, are all A, and then 9 through 16 are B, same type thing. And you would just have to go to an awful lot of thought, at least I would, and probably write some things down and have some, outlines and things to work from. But occasionally, then, these parts of Scripture are done. When you read the book of Lamentations, and we did this always with our kids when they were small, Jeremiah was in Jerusalem, and he is the weeping prophet. And he was so sad that he needed to write a lament. And so as Jeremiah writes Lamentations, chapters 1, 2, and 4 each begin with the letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And then when you come to chapter 3, there are 3 verses for each letter. And so when someone takes the time to do this, there's just a lot of extra kind of thought and preparation that has gone through that. But when you look at number 4, just going down the first page, many of the virtues of the excellent wife have been previously discussed earlier in the book. And so chapter 31 functions like a well-written sermon. And I just put sometimes, it doesn't, structure is very different, but sometimes, and we don't always have 3 points in a prayer or a poem, but you know what I'm trying to say. If the major points are given, then at a certain point, the preacher will go back and just highlight, here was number 1, here was number 2, here was number 3, and summarize and bring those things together. And so just in a few words, this will kind of be the summary of the lesson. And this is how I think the poem about the virtuous woman functions from Proverbs, is that all of this teaching about wisdom and instruction in the fear of the Lord has been flowing through the book. And then just as we close, then we use the word personification. Here is wisdom personified in the virtues and the actions of this particular woman. One of the writers earlier, just in speaking about Proverbs in general, says, when I read Proverbs, I think of wisdom in work clothes. And it's not highly theoretical. It's not, well, what about in someday and possibility? There's a real sense of wisdom in work clothes, and it's kind of the hands-on and the doing part of it. So when you look at this virtuous woman, and this is number 5 here in the middle, industrious, resourceful, selfless. She rises early while it is yet night. It describes her ability to run a household competently and efficiently. And the numerous tasks this woman performs are many. Business dealings, she is selling her homemade clothing, she's buying and running a vineyard, she has religious duties as feeding the poor and the needy, she's teaching. She's not so tired that she can't have kind counsel on her tongue. Sometimes when we're doing all this, we're all just kind of exhausted, but the law of kindness is on her tongue. And they illustrate her capacity for sustained work. I had never thought of this until studying through this time. And just think about this. You may or may not have a handle for this, but just see what you think. When you look at, well, let me step back, and we'll come up a little bit later. We use the expression, both Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly are mentioned especially in these first 9 chapters. And wisdom is the personification in a female form because the word wisdom in Hebrew is feminine. And so in the book of Proverbs, wisdom is personified in the figure of 2 women, Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. One's positive and obviously one's a very negative example. And before we come to the excellent wife in chapter 31, when you read chapter 1, Wisdom is at the heads of the gates, the cities. She's out in the square, the marketplace. She's very public. And as we noticed, the largest section in the first 9 chapters is also the discussion. So is Lady Folly. And this idea of being out and calling and soliciting is very, very significant. But she is at the city gates, the streets, and she is searching for anyone who will listen to her words. 133, he who listens to me will dwell secure and will be at ease without dread of evil. And so here it is, personification, give her like flesh and blood, and she is speaking and she is calling out, and being Lady Wisdom, feminine, then she's calling out especially to the young and the simple and those who will listen, and those who are fools are unteachable. They will not be those who listen, but she is calling out. And then notice the second thing. When we come to chapter 8, and this is the nearest thing to John 1 in the Old Testament, because wisdom is personified as being by God's side when creation is done, but she's still calling out. And notice chapter 8, 4 and 5, to you, O men, I call, and my cry is to the sons of men. O simple ones, learn prudence. Foolish men, pay attention. And she's still seeking companionship. She's still out, again, in the public, calling and asking, do you want to listen? Do you want to be a part of this? As chapter 9 closes this parenthesis of thought of the early part of the book, then we have 2 different dinners that are given, and one of the dinners is hosted by Lady Wisdom. And notice the progression, and I think of this kind of like a younger lady dating. Now has a house, she's built 7 pillars, and she's preparing a meal. But the same type thing is there. She sends out the younger women, come and eat my bread, drink of the wine I have mixed, leave simpleness and live, and walk in the way of insight. And so we go from kind of like a single girl in terms of just her by herself calling out. By the time we get to chapter 9, here's wisdom dwelling in a house, and then personification. When we come to chapter 31, here is a married woman with children. And so in one sense, as you read through the book of Proverbs, it's kind of like the progression of the life of a godly young woman going through life. And by the time we come across her as the book closes in this personification, then she is the excellent wife. She is now married, and she is the personification of traits of wisdom, like I said, that have been mentioned all through the book. So if you turn the page, and again, if you just come in, there are outlines on the back 2 tables. When I read this personification, speaking and acting and doing and all of these different things, it just reminds me of John 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, all things were made. He became flesh and dwelt among us. And yes, he is literally God, but in a poetical way. And from the very first night, we've said, the books of poetry commend in poetical form what the law commands. And all of these teachings, especially from the Torah, from the law of Moses, are now going to be commended in poetical form. And so Lady Wisdom is going to function and give insights to how wisdom conducts herself on a day-to-day basis. But here's what's significant. This whole thing about eating with people in the ancient Near East had a strong sense of relationship. And while this has nothing to do with our topic whatsoever, even when we come to the New Testament, if I'm living in open sin and Gary comes and talks with me, and then 2 or 3, and I keep living in sin, and 2 or 3 others come and talk with me, and I keep living in sin, Gary, what are you supposed to do? Withdraw fellowship, and then Paul's very specific, do not eat with such a one. And so when you look at this progression through the book, you go from calling out on the streets and the corners and soliciting and trying to bring people in. And then when we have the house, and how interesting the 7 columns You know how significant 7 is through Scripture. Here's a complete house. Do you remember what the psalmist says? Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build the house labor in vain. And so here is wisdom's house with 7 columns, and she prepares the meal. And when people participated in a meal, it had a significant part of developing a relationship. So when you look at 2:1, wisdom has called out to the young men. Let me just pause for a half second. I don't want to stay here very long. This is really painful. 3 really close friends. I don't even know how to say this. This really hurts. 3 really close friends over the last 50 years have got involved with a lady at work and have left a wife and a family and fill in the blank to go find themselves or something else. I talked to an older preacher, and he said some of the most heartbreaking things I've ever been involved with is just the shattering of a family, like broken glass everywhere. And it has to do with his infidelity. And so the call oftentimes is to young men and to the simple. But I just keep reminding you, Solomon wasn't a teenager when his wives turned his heart from God. So this isn't, oh, well, once we get through the teenage years, it's all downhill and everything's done. This is kind of a lifetime thing. The call and the appeal is yes to the young men and to the simple. And so wisdom, and here she is personified, she has called to the young men, and I just used one of the passages, stay away from lady folly and married women who are soliciting, okay? And here's the verse. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman, and anticipate, embrace the bosom of an adulteress? And this is on folly. And anticipate, we're going to hear embrace in a second with wisdom. And notice the intimacy of these terms. A man's ways are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all of his paths. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house. Her feet go down to death, and her steps follow the path to Sheol. Now, all of us have been involved in different kinds of situations. We were in a group, and we'll just leave it in a group, where one of the guy's wives was just really, can I say handsy, and you know what I'm trying to say? She just was very happy to just touch guys other than her husband quite a lot. And after the first time, I spent the rest of the time keeping someone between me and her for the rest of the day. I just didn't want to have to deal with that. And in one way or another, we've all been in situations where it's much better to prevent something than to deal with it. Female in this case, she was at a seminar for a week. They were doing all these various things. They were divided into small groups. She's living in a hotel away, and she said, my leader was really nice looking. He was very professional. He was very kind. She said, I even liked his cologne. And so I went and asked to be moved to another group. She said, why should I have to fight this all week long when I can just move and remove myself from this? And so one of the things that wisdom says is, stay away from it. Even Sunday night, to his credit, Potiphar's wife grabs his cloak, and what does he do? Runs for his life. And so a part of wisdom has been to say, stay away from lady folly, married women who are interested in a relationship. And then the second part of wisdom is marry the right woman. Eat the dinner she prepares and have a relationship with Lady Wisdom, and listen to the father admonishing his son, starting Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 4. Let your heart hold fast to my words. Get wisdom, get insight. Do not forget and do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom, and whatever you do, get insight. Prize her highly, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place on your head a graceful garland, and she will bestow on you a beautiful crown. And so what we have is the call, one, to avoid any relationship with Lady Folly on this side, and then to, can we use the word cultivate, and using the biblical word to embrace, and from chapter 9, that would be go to her house and eat dinner. Okay. While we're not specifically talking about food, what types of things are part of the nourishment? Knowledge, wisdom, discretion, insight, understanding are those types of things. So, stay away from one type of woman, marry the right woman. And then sprinkle throughout the book is wisdom about focusing on the woman who is your wife rather than flirting with Lady Folly and her companions. And this is really significant because it's an ongoing challenge in different ways in different parts of our lives. And notice these statements encouraging men to do that. Proverbs 5:18, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. And if you were not here when we did this, the paragraph in Proverbs chapter 5 is one of the most specific statements about the relationship between a husband and wife that's in the book of Proverbs. Chapter 12 and verse 4, an excellent wife is the crown of her husband. 18:22, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. I love 19:14. House and wealth are inherited from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. And so these are the admonitions that the house of wisdom and Lady Wisdom has been given to people along the way. I had never seen this and was reading a couple of things, and this just really clicked. In some of the Hebrew manuscripts, the book of Ruth follows the book of Proverbs. Okay? We're going to do law, history, poetry, prophecy. The Hebrew Bibles are going to be organized differently. And in several of the manuscripts, then you're going to read Proverbs, and then the very next book you're going to read is the book of Ruth. And so when you look at the virtuous woman in Proverbs 31, verses 10 and 29, and I used an older translation for this just to make the use of the word. And I don't know Hebrew, but I just left the Hebrew alphabet on the side just so you can see where it would flow on the chronology. But who can find, and the older translation said, a valiant wife, for her price is far above stones. Other translations will use the word excellent, noble character, a good wife, a virtuous woman. And then when you come to the end of this acrostic in verse 29 of Proverbs 31, many daughters have done valiantly, but thou excellest them all. And again, excellent, noble things virtuously. But the other thing to notice is that in other contexts, especially in military context, this word for the excellent wife is also a word in a military context for strong. And all of those words all of those meanings are a part of the word when you pick it up. So if you look at the next page, in the Hebrew manuscript, you've read through this part of Proverbs, and then when you come to the book of Ruth, Boaz is going to say to her in chapter 3 and verse 11, and again, older translation, and now, my daughter, fear not. I will do unto thee all that thou hast said, for all the city of my people know that thou art a valiant woman, using the older translation. And again, worthy, virtuous, a woman of excellence, of noble character. But as you keep reading through the book of Ruth, the term is a little bit different, but Boaz in chapter 2 and verse 1 is also described as a valiant man in terms of acting worthily. He has standing, he has reputation. And what you're going to find is that This couple are then called, and you'll see this in 4:11, this blessing is given to them, that together they are to bring about valiance again, which is excellence or good standing or reputation. And I just use the term Ruth is probably as close of a biblical example of the virtuous woman in the book of Proverbs 31 that you're going to find in Scripture. And because in our English Bibles, the texts are totally separated, but you just stop and think, if you're reading through a Hebrew transcript and just reading that, and you finish Proverbs, then the next thing you're going to read is Ruth, and how interesting that probably the closest female character that we come across in Scripture is given right after that. So, four parallels between Ruth and Our Lady in Proverbs 31. Both are paradigms of loyalty and fidelity. Ruth leaves behind native home, her religion, remember, your God will be my God, your people will be my people. I don't mean this to be sarcastic or anything, but 2 or 3 times, talking with a couple, planning the wedding or whatever, whether thou goest, I will go and stuff. And I said, I don't mind reading this as long as you understand these words were originally spoken to a mother-in-law. If you're happy with that, I'm happy to read it, but just like for you to know that this was, first of all, said not between a husband, and it's very appropriate for a husband and wife. But it just, for some people, has a little different flavor if that's what is said, by a daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. They're wonderful words, but what did Ruth do? She left her home, she left her family, and your God will be my God, your people will be my people. And in Proverbs 31, we see this same attachment to family because this woman is giving ceaseless attention to her family and her household needs. She's just working all the time to take care of her family. Both act with tremendous resourcefulness. Ruth is going to provide a livelihood for herself, working with her hands out in the fields, and her mother-in-law. And again, here's this word courage. When you see the word excellent or valiant or worthy, when you pick up a biblical word, it a lot of times has multiple meanings. This word will be used. He was a valiant warrior. He was a courageous warrior. Well, she has the courage to go in and sleep at Boaz's feet and inform him he's the near kinsman. And by her courage to do this, then she perpetuates the memory of both her deceased father-in-law and her husband. And here is a valiant man who is willing not to own the property himself, but the property will ultimately go to their children because of the descendants through the family. And her courage caused her to do this. And you'll find the worthy woman. She manages her household with ingenuity and with prudence and with diligence. And both are portrayed in terms of their marriage, their homes, and their families. Ruth ends in her marriage to Boaz and the birth of a son. And as a widow, she builds a house for herself and her mother-in-law. The elders and the people pronounce a blessing over Ruth in 4:11, evoking the memory of Rachel and Leah, who together built the house of Israel. And so Rachel, Leah, and Ruth are all renowned for having, quote, built up their houses. The worthy woman, Proverbs 31, she is settled down with a husband and with children, a house which she earlier looked forward to securing for herself. And can I just say this? Those of you who know my wife, I just call her the Israelite in whom there's no guile. She just kind of says how it is sometimes. She says, and what is her husband doing while she's doing all of this? I said, well, he's going to sit at the gates. She said, yes, and? And she said, here's the lady working from dawn to dark and doing all this stuff. And yes, I know it's a singular focus and everything, but she said, I just would like to know, and what on earth is he doing while she's working her fingers to the bone and doing all this stuff? She's up before the chickens, and she's working, and she's selling and do all this. And I said, well, it's a big job going to sit at the city gates and to take care of that. And obviously, it's a focus on a singular part of the relationship, but still, the question comes to mind. I just had a comment in the middle of this. In Proverbs, to choose the path of wisdom or folly ultimately results in a relationship. Let me just pause for a second. I'm in 1 Corinthians, and Paul says what? Evil companions do what? Corrupt good morals. And we've all seen people who have gotten involved with, and you just fill in the blank, someone at work or someone else. And when you start talking about the path, and you start talking about the way, and then you start talking about going to her house for dinner, and you start talking about all of these different things, then this call and this decision has to be made. Which of these two paths are we going to walk along? And one of the things that I pray for grandchildren especially is that God will continue to help them to have godly friends. Because like I said, we have just cried tears at times over these three friends of ours, in that in some cases we've been left with the wife and the kids and abandoned and all this other stuff. And it's just absolutely heartbreaking. And so when you start talking about the path and the way, then decisions have to be made, relationships are formed. And so in preparation for a relationship, initially with the young man or the simple, and she's calling out, Lady Wisdom, let him who lacks sense come in. She is going to send young women to call from the highest places. She's built a house. There's the pillars, slaughtered for the meal, mixed the wine, sent out to invite companionship with her at the dinner that she's prepared. And this is how chapter 9 closes, is again this dinner invitation to come and to dine. And Lady Folly's doing the same thing. Stolen bread is sweet, things eaten in secret, and she's inviting people again to the meal, which is the precursor to an ongoing relationship. And then number 4, both women are praised for what they do. Boaz calls Ruth blessed and declares her to be, and here's this word, this worthy woman. Valiant was her older translation. And then in Proverbs 31:28, the women's children bless her, and the husband declares that she is a worthy woman who surpasses all other women. So a part of the blessing, and I always appreciate the opportunity just to study and think and to do this, but I'll never read this part of Proverbs the same again without having this attachment with Ruth, because as the Word becomes flesh in Jesus, Ruth is one of those very close biblical examples of, because of what she had left and what she became, of being this virtuous woman. But I had to laugh reading through this. How appropriate is it that the man after God's own heart, David, his great-great-grandmother, is a flesh and blood example of the worthy woman of Proverbs 31. Where did she come from? Moab. She's a foreigner. She's not an Israelite. And that's that wonderful thing when you read the genealogy in Matthew 4. Then there are these 4 women mentioned that are very unusual in different ways. And here's a woman who is not a daughter of Abraham, who is not a part of the original family, but chooses to integrate to Mary. And so David's great-great-grandmother is this woman of virtue and excellence. And a part of the family tree is that David then will become known as the man after God's own heart. So Boaz and Ruth, Obed, Jesse, and then here is David. So this is how this settled as I kind of looked at it. As this section in 31:10 opens, the question is, a worthy woman who can find? And when you come to Ruth 31 in verse 11, all of my kinsmen know you are a worthy woman. And so the irony is that the question which opens Proverbs 31, then when you read the next book, then Boaz said, "You're the one, and that quality is actually yours." A brief quotation, and then I'm just going to read through the section, and then we'll close with these final comments. The powerful and all-neglected nature of farming, this is the back page, food, houses, service, and mercy, in the context of fearing the Lord, makes Ruth a fitting narrative to follow the song of Proverbs 31. As men and women, we are called to imitate the heroism of Boaz and Ruth and this woman of wisdom. A good wife, 31:10, who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. I love this verse. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like ships of the merchant bringing her food from afar. She rises while it is still night and provides food for her household and task for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it, and with the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She girds her loins with strength, and hear this word valiant and strong. There's a sense of strength with this. And makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hands to the poor and reaches her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all of her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes herself covering. Her clothes are fine linen and purple. Okay, guys, here's our part. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders at the city. And that's the part where Sheila just starts laughing. She says, well, finally he's doing something. She makes fine linen garments and sells them. She delivers girdles to the merchants. Strength and dignity. And see again, notice that strong part that goes through the thread of the book, of the poem. Strength and dignity are her clothing. She laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom. The teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household, does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you've surpassed them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. So when you look at the contrast between the worthy woman and the loose woman, it's just total opposites all the way through. The virtuous woman builds a house. She's doing things constructive. The loose woman ultimately is going to tear things down. And the relationship with the Lady Wisdom is going to lead to life, and the relationship with Lady Folly leads to death. I always think of this when I read passages about women. The only thing that's not good in Genesis 1 and 2 is our world without women in it. Every day God says, oh, that's good, that's good, that's good. And then to have a group of guys all by themselves, that is not good. And the only thing that is not good in the first opening of Scripture are men by ourselves. Ladies, you're such a blessing. When we were at OC, Howard Norton would say, guys, never, ever go to the mission field single. He said, always find a good wife. She will do most of the work so you can get most of the credit. He said, do not be silly enough to do this by yourself. He said, always take a wife with you. Won't go into details, but we had an extended period of time in Campbelltown where we had 100 people a month through our house. Ladies' class, fellowships, Bible studies, discussions. Ladies, just think, for a better part of a year, what would your house look like if you're having 100 people a month through your house? And what's the statement? If mama's not happy, nobody's happy. And that was just taken right in stride, and you think that's a huge thing. Our youngest daughter because Sheila's so handy and does so many things, she said, I just assumed, as she started going through, I assumed that ladies made their own clothes, did decorating cakes. She's actually the household repairman in our house. I don't want it to break, so I let her do that. And so she let us all this stuff. And Lee said, I assumed that everyone did that, but after I got married, I figured out that I'd been raised with Martha Stewart minus the ankle bracelet. And she said, I just assumed that all mothers did all the things that my mom did, but that wasn't the case. What I'm going to close with, when we lived in Memphis for 3 years, we worked in Mississippi. And very early, thankfully, the lady was housebound, but her name was Grandma House. And rephrase that. Son was an elder, eventually grandson is going to be an elder. But I want you to think about this. She taught a one-room school for 40 years. Let me say that again. She taught a one-room school for 40 years. So she taught ABC and algebra on the same day. And there was a whole group of kids that when they went to Ole Miss or Mississippi State, they had one teacher when they went to college. Does that make your head hurt? 40 years. When she retired, she says, I read every word of the Wall Street Journal every day just so I'll know what's going on in the world. And so you can begin to see this is just not your average person. And we had a lady that everything was wrong, Miss Awfulizer, it's terrible and everything. And I never went to see her unless I could go straight to Grandma House and visit her because she was just the epitome of the opposite of everything. She had kept N.B. Hartman in her home when he was doing meetings and preaching. And she grew roses, gave roses away by the 5-gallon buckets. When she was able to get out, she would go out and just literally cut 5-gallon buckets of roses and take them and give them to people or take them to church. We were good friends with a daughter-in-law who was not a Christian when she was married. Miss Pam, how did you become a Christian? She says, nobody's around Grandma House very long without hearing the truth. And she said you just couldn't hardly resist because her life was such a compliment to the teachings of the Bible. And so, Gary, I'm getting to know a church in a town of 5,000 and the people, and I get to feeling she's bedfast. She's in her middle to late 80s. But the heartbeat of this church is still this lady in terms of her spirituality and her focus and things. I go by to see her one afternoon, and I could tell she was a little bit upset. And boy, I mean, the light came on. She said, I am so glad you're here. And I said, yes, ma'am, what's going on? She said, well, since I've had my stroke, every afternoon, I sit here after lunch and I put all the books of the Old Testament in order because since I can't read anymore, I might get confused. And so every afternoon I put them all in order so I'll always be able to remember the chronological order of the books of the Old Testament. And today, I can't remember if Habakkuk came before or after the fall of Jerusalem. And I won't be able to sleep tonight unless I can figure that out. Can you tell me, did the book of Habakkuk come before or after the fall of Jerusalem? What are you going to tell her? I said, let me just check. I don't want to get you confused. I think I know, but let me just check. Well, the reason I knew is that the last 3 of the minor prophets are in exile, and Habakkuk is in the time of Jeremiah. But I said, let me just double check and we'll see. And looked at it, and sure enough, Habakkuk and Jeremiah and Zephaniah are 3 prophets just before the fall of Jerusalem. And then that's what I said. I said, Grandma House, you remember Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. And then Habakkuk's asking these questions. Why are you letting the godless go unpunished? Yes, I'm going to punish them, but they're worse than we are, but And I said, Habakkuk's this book of questions, but I said Habakkuk comes just before the fall of Jerusalem. Smile came back. Everything was fine, and she said, thank you. I'll be able to sleep tonight. All of us will have different aptitudes and different abilities, but when I read the book of Proverbs and the virtuous woman, we all have different skills, we have different abilities, but I think I get tired when I read Proverbs 31, but I also get tired of thinking, running a one-room school building for 40 years and teaching ABC and algebra. You'd obviously have to have the kids to help you to do that. But in many ways, she was the epitome of this lady. 2 lines and we're done. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her worth is far above rubies. Another translation says, an excellent wife who can find. She is far more precious than jewels. And what a wonderful way to consider the teaching in the book of Proverbs, in that, yes, it commends what the law commands, but is the personification of wisdom in human form. God bless.